Hello, I'm James, and I'm an old guy in Europe. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of An Old Guy in Europe. Thanks for joining me. Today, I thought I'd like to share with you my initial impressions and experiences of Portugal in general, but mostly of the Ericeira area where I chose to start my journey here in Portugal. So I hope you enjoy this little, it's not really a tour, but gives you kind of an idea of Ericeira and some of my experiences, and I hope you enjoy it. My first day in Portugal actually started in the United States at the San Francisco International Airport in California. I was so excited to get to Portugal. I didn't sleep very well the night before. I woke up early and I got to the San Francisco International Airport 3 hours before my flight was scheduled to depart. I had chosen to fly on the Portuguese airline TAP because it was the only nonstop direct flight from San Francisco to Lisbon, and that also made it the shortest flight available. I wanted to fly nonstop direct because I didn't want to deal with any of the stress of having to make transfers, layovers, luggage getting lost, any of that. I just wanted to be able to get on a plane in San Francisco and get off that same plane when I landed in Lisbon. This strategy worked very well for me, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's flying internationally, particularly if it's a first time to begin a new life in a new country. It was an 11-hour flight from San Francisco to Lisbon, and I had learned from a couple other trips I had taken to Europe that a great strategy to help reduce or eliminate jet lag after arriving is to get as much sleep as possible during what would be normally your sleep time if you were still in California. So with Lisbon being 8 hours ahead of San Francisco, I had decided to try to get as much sleep as I could several hours into the flight. That wasn't a very useful plan because I found it almost impossible to sleep. And the other part of this strategy is to stay awake until what would have been your normal bedtime at your destination. So my plan was to stay awake until somewhere between 10 and 11 p.m. Portugal time. That strategy works very well. And of course, getting no sleep on the plane and very little sleep the day before, it was well over 24 hours before I finally was able to put myself to sleep on my first day in Portugal. Of course, by the time we were 10 hours or so into the flight, I was getting very, very excited to be arriving in Portugal. And it wasn't too long before I got my first glance of the Portugal coastline along the Atlantic. That really got me excited, knowing I would most likely be landing within the hour. A bridge that looked just like the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco came into view in my window. As I found out later, the name of that bridge was the Ponte 25 de Abril, which is the bridge of 25th of April, which in 1974 was the date of the mostly peaceful revolution in Portugal. And the body of water that I mentioned that the bridge was spanning was the Tagus River, or in Portuguese, Taiju River, as we descended slowly and almost magically into Lisbon, Portugal. Navigating my way through the airport and to customs was fairly straightforward, as all the signage was in both Portuguese and English, and that's where everyone was going. When I arrived at customs, there must have been at least 200, maybe 300 people in line waiting to pass through. And later I discovered that there were 3 or 4 flights that had all arrived within a very short period of time of each other. So everyone was in the customs area waiting to get processed. Shortly after that, I found my way to baggage claim, grabbed my one checked-on suitcase, as I have everything I own in one checked-on bag, one carry-on bag, and a backpack. So the 4 of us, me and my 3 pieces of luggage, found our way to the International Arrivals Gate and stepped out onto what felt like a stage overlooking a huge audience. There were so many people waiting for arrivals. It's a good thing Louisa had told me she would be wearing a yellow t-shirt, despite the fact that she didn't care for the color yellow in her clothing, in order to stand out, because it was very helpful. I believe I mentioned Sidonio and Louisa in the previous 2 episodes over the course of my interview, but just as a reminder, Louisa and I had met months before online, establishing a language exchange, and had become friends in that time. In the course of that, it turned out that Louisa and Sidonio had a studio unit that they had available for rent, that they had converted from their garage, and made that available to me, and then very kindly and generously offered to pick me up at the airport when I arrived in Portugal and to drive me home, essentially. So Louise and I left the terminal and briefly waited for Sidonio to pull around in the car, where we loaded up my 3 pieces of luggage very quickly and were on our way to Ericeira. Now, Ericeira is about 40 to 45 kilometers from Lisbon, which equates to roughly a 40 to 45-minute drive. On our drive home, I got my very first feel of Portugal, and the feelings were calm and peaceful and safe and kind. I really felt like I had arrived home. And of course, everything I was seeing out the windows was brand new and different and almost overwhelming when added to those feelings. The drive home felt only like moments, not like nearly an hour. And before I knew it, we had arrived at a place called Mafra, where a huge building appeared as we were passing by. And I came to find out that that was the National Palace of Mafra, which, as Louisa described it, was more or less the summer home for the royalty back in the day. That is one heck of a summer home. And within only about 10 minutes, we had arrived at my new home in Ericeira, just about 4.5 kilometers outside of Ericeira village. Louisa and Sidonio had generously offered to treat me to my first almoço in Ericeira. And almoço is the main meal of the day in Portugal, usually taken somewhere between 1 and 3 in the afternoon. So shortly after unloading my luggage, we headed into the Ericeira villa. Of course, Louisa and Sidonio wanted to share their town and my new home with me, so we took a short walk into Ericeira before we headed off for almoço at the restaurant, where it turns out their son, Guilherme, worked as a cook. Shortly after beginning our walk, we came to a spot that I had seen many photos of when I was still in California, and I was suddenly overcome with this feeling of I've arrived. I'm here. It felt in a funny way like it was the entrance to Disneyland or something. And of course, you see photos of the entrance to Disneyland, you go, oh, wow, that's neat. And then you get there and it's a whole different story. This was 10 times more that for me. And had my first sense of actually being where I had planned to be for so many months prior to getting here. After a relatively short stroll through what felt like a short stroll through Disneyland to me, we headed off to the restaurant for me to meet Guillermo and to share almoço together. I have to say, by this time, after an entire day of traveling and arriving in this new place, the excitement, the emotions of being here, all the new sights and sounds and smells of being in this new place, I was pretty exhausted. Nevertheless, the meal was delicious and fun, and it was really great to get to know Sidonio better and to share all of this with who eventually became my Portuguese family. And one very important thing I learned at this meal was Imperial. An Imperial, which I later learned is called a Fina up north in the Porto area, is an ice-cold beer served from the tap in a 250 milliliter glass, which is somewhere around 8 ounces or maybe a little less. And for me, it's the perfect size. And at that particular point, it was absolutely delicious and refreshing. These days, if I'm out with friends, it's not unusual to see me with an Imperial in my hand. So after a wonderful meal shared with my new friends and family, we headed back home, and I was so exhausted at that point. I just wanted to rest, settle in, get comfortable, and probably pretty early, I don't remember exactly what time, I was sound asleep in my new home in Portugal.